Good afternoon and welcome to BioStrategy's Partners Practical Knowledge Series. This is our third panel in the series for 2020, and today's topic is customer discovery. So a little bit about BioStrategy Partners. BioStrategy Partners is a not-for-profit organization. Our principal programs are the Practical Knowledge Series, which is designed to educate entrepreneurs and potential academic spinouts and those related to those organizations about the things that help grow a business, how to properly start a business, how to grow your business, how to avoid this common pitfalls and mistakes. And we are not-for-profit. Our other core program is the Germinator program, which is a mechanism for developing technologies through industry academic partnerships. Today, our panel is, again, customer discovery, understanding who will use, buy, and benefit from your invention. We have as our moderator today, Mike Rinkunas, and panelists Susan Hamilton and Michelle Histan. And as always, we like to be sure to thank our sponsors. We have MVM Associates. We have Cesare Revis, intellectual property law firm, and typically our location is at University Place Associates. We thank them for their support. Today, as you might imagine, as so many others, we are coming to you remotely due to the current pandemic. But we are so excited to have this, this panel prepared for you today on customer discovery. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Mike.
Hello, everyone. As Michelle introduced, my name is Mike Rinkunas. I am a Director Acceleration at the Delaware Innovation Space, and I am in the process of actually moving down full-time to the University of Delaware as an Associate Director of Commercialization. Very high-level background, serial entrepreneur. I've had some things that turned out as very, very painful lessons, learning lessons, and then a lot stemmed from lack of customer discovery. So I'm really excited to actually be able to talk with both Susan Hamilton and Michelle Histan, because this is also in their expertise and wheelhouse. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Susan to introduce herself, and then we'll move to Michelle so we can get quick backgrounds on everyone.
Thank you so much, Mike. My name is Sue Hamilton. I am a Senior Vice President at Divine & Partners. We are a Center City, Philadelphia public relations firm. I've been there for just about 15 years. Our expertise is in communications and content management. Three areas that we focus on primarily are public relations, issues management, and digital communications. And our clients are mostly, we're in many industries, but we do have a lot of clients in healthcare, education, finance, tourism, nonprofits. Those are some of the organizations that we support.
Nice. I'll jump in. Hi, I'm Michelle Histan. I head up innovation. I'm Director of Innovation at Independence Blue Cross. We are a local health insurer in Philadelphia. I have a small team, and we essentially use design to solve business problems. So we do that for our internal business areas as well as our external customer groups, which means that although our day-to-day is focused on health insurance, we get to work in a lot of different areas as we're working with some of our customers on their business issues. And I've been doing that for almost 8 years now.
Thank you, guys. One thing I'm going to take a quick moment to do is talk through a little bit about lean startup methodology and design thinking, just to give everyone a baseline. So I'll spend 2 minutes here very quickly. One of the things that we see is the crux of any business is actually really around customer discovery. If you look at the business model canvas, the center, the keystone of the business model canvas is the value proposition. And the way that you are able to determine what that value proposition is from talking to customers, understanding what is their problem, what are the opportunity or challenges they face, and also understanding the severity of that. There's a good analogy of the vitamin, aspirin, antibiotics problem. So ideally what you want to do is actually, as you're interviewing customers, determine what's that problem and how intense that is. There are a lot of great books on the topic around design thinking, everything from Eric Ries to Austin Wilder to an older book I just learned about, Nail It and Scale It. But all the ideas are really focused around that design thinking. This is so important. Actually, the NSF, National Science Foundation, runs a program called I-Core that actually is focused on taking technologies, research being done at universities, and teaching scientists how to go and talk to customers so that they're not just inventing a hammer and looking for a nail. This is all about actually solving people's problems so that you can take this out into the market and potentially do something with it versus sitting on a shelf. While that's very high level, I'm happy to answer any questions folks have later on the I-Core program. But what I actually want to do is I'm going to toss things over to Michelle quickly, because I actually want to hear more about that design to solve business problems. Where do you start, and a little bit about that process, especially in an environment like Independence Blue Cross, which is not exactly a small insurance company in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So we do primarily use design thinking. I like to say we use a mashup of tools that come from design thinking and from lean startup and from all different disciplines, and some are just smart project tools. But essentially, I think at the core, we're using primarily design thinking tools. And really, I always say that design thinking, when you look at it on paper, looks like this linear process, right? So it's 5 steps. It's empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And it looks really neat and pat, but you can start anywhere, and you can start all over the place, and it kind of ends up being this big circle and mishmash of things that you do. So where we start depends heavily on what the need is. The way it works, I always say my team is essentially like a team of consultants. So anybody can call us up and say, we're trying to fix this, or we're trying to flesh out this opportunity, or we're trying to solve for X, Y, and Z. As you said, it's very often in response to a problem. We want to fix this issue. So it kind of depends where the business is and what they've already done. There are times that we will jump right to, gosh, we've done some research, we have an idea, and we'll help them prototype it, and then we'll go back to customer discovery. Let's get that prototype in front of people and have them react to it. But often we're starting at, wow, we have to dig into this more, and we have to do essentially design research, which is, customer discovery. We have to go out and we have to talk to people and understand what they need and what they want. So it really just depends kind of where things are and where we're starting, and then we'll follow the process from there and use the tools that we need to from that point on. So that's kind of how it works for us.
Quick question. As you describe this as a linear process, is it once you complete one step, is that step forever done and in concrete?
Never. That's a great question. We are always going back and forth. So I teach this at Temple as well, and I tell my students that because we're done talking about this step for right now doesn't mean it's over. So we're constantly going back and forth between steps and revisiting, and I'd say when it comes to customer discovery and talking to customers or users, that's never over, right? That should always be happening throughout the entire process. I had a conversation yesterday with some software developers internally about the agile method, which is very similar. I say it's design thinking for software and for IT, but we were just talking about the fact that you should constantly be talking to your customer along the way to validate that what you're doing is the right thing. So yeah.
Well, building on that, Susan, if you want to walk through working, as Michelle's looking internally, you're looking at engaging external clients. Can you walk through a little bit of how you do customer discovery?
Yeah, I think the main thing I want to communicate is that it's not a hard process. It's an easy thing. It doesn't take a lot of resources to do it. It's not a very expensive thing to do. And so I just want people to understand, as they're thinking about how this applies perhaps to their own project or their own business, that it's not a difficult thing to do. And from our point of view as communicators for our firm, where we do public relations and issues management and digital communications, we do a lot of content development. What we focus on is listening. So really the discovery process for us is a process of listening and listening to customers or stakeholders. And I thought maybe the most helpful thing that I could do would be to share a case study of a project that we've been working on, and just explain how we put the process to that, and give an example of how people could probably easily implement this themselves. Does that make some sense to the group to do that?
Absolutely.
So one of the clients that we work with is the CEO Council for Growth and Select Greater Philadelphia. They're both councils of the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia, and we've been working with them for about 1.5 years now on a project that they had identified, where they were looking at the leadership role that Greater Philadelphia plays in cell and gene therapy and gene editing and connected health technology. And they wanted to grow the awareness of that leadership role and promote Greater Philadelphia as a hub for cell and gene therapy and connected health. So as part of that, we had the objective of creating some messaging around the initiative, which we call now the Cell and Gene Therapy and Connected Health Initiative. And in order to do that messaging, we started with research. And we just give you a sense of how we began that research. We decided that we would do research in 3 areas. One, we would do, our tactics would be one-on-one interviews. That would be the first one. We also did a digital survey. And then we did some focus groups. So those 3 things are easy to implement in your own company, in your own organization, as you're developing your own product and looking for background information. So in setting out to develop this messaging, we started first with the stakeholders in our partnership here. So there was a collaboration. There were 11 partners in the collaboration, and those partners consisted of companies, research institutions, and educational institutions. And they geographically were southeastern Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and the northern part of Delaware. And what we did is we developed a 30-minute phone interview, and then we identified a sample group of the stakeholders. And the important thing was not so much the number of people that we interviewed, but it was important to make sure that it was representative, so that we were able to have a cross-section. And so in doing that, we also made sure, in having a good sample of organizations, that we also had a good sampling of job functions, so that we had both researchers and we had administrators. I see Michelle shaking her head. That, I mean, that's kind of, I'm sure in your teaching too, that's important to have that good representative sample. And so we developed a list of questions, and I'll just give you a sense of some of those questions. I think we had about a dozen questions, and we set out for a 30-minute discussion. It doesn't have to be that long. It can be a little bit less, but we made sure that we had an opportunity to have some discussion at the end. And it was important for us to make sure that the same person was conducting those interviews throughout, so that they got a sense of other discussions that had been had, but it was really a topic guide. So it's pretty easy for you to do that, among your group. And one of the things is we started with, please tell us a little bit about your work, and how you got involved in this cell and gene therapy and connected health initiative. And that gave us a little chance to understand their background. And then we started talking about the industry itself. So we asked a question like, what do you see as the purpose of this industry? Who do you see as the most important audiences? What do you think are the region's most important and attractive assets as it relates to the goals of the Cell and Gene Therapy and Connected Health Initiative? What are the 3 most important messages for the target audiences to know? What's the single greatest differentiator for the region? How would you quantify success for the initiative? So that gave us some benchmarks. And then we tested some of the marketing that we had had started, some of the taglines and things, so you could ask a question about your product specifically there. And then we asked for success stories, so that, because one of the key objectives of the initiative is to do some storytelling. So that just gives you a sense of the topic guide that we had. And what was really this is kind of qualitative, not quantitative, so it was important to really stay open in our questions to validating things that we thought, but also allowing things to be invalidated, and that we were careful not to take anything for granted. And it was, again, a process of a lot of listening and note-taking and sort of guiding the discussion if we got into something that was interesting. And what's great about this process is that you may end up with some really interesting things that you hadn't thought of, might help you lead to some very specific elements of the messaging. And so it was a really great process and not a difficult thing to do. It's important to leave some time to do it. We had about 6 weeks to do this. Most of it took to setting up the appointments, to get people the time.
Well, Susan, if I may, you actually hit on a point I wanted to stress, and actually I want to hand things back to Michelle. Quantitative versus qualitative.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And how important is that difference?
For us, it's really important. So I think, design, I believe that design is really focused on qualitative, and qualitative meaning you are talking to people and you're getting their feedback, rather than I'm doing a survey to see how many people like the color pink, right? That's good data to have if that's what I need to know, but I can't get deep into how does pink make you feel, right? And very often we're looking for feelings and emotions because that's what makes people do things. That's what makes people act, right? So I would say every project we do, we are focused on qualitative research, and we often supplement that with quantitative. We sometimes do want quantitative data, but very often we're looking to understand how people feel and what they need and what they're interested in. A project that we're working on right now, although it's been put a little bit on hold because of our current situation, but Mike, it speaks to what you talked about in the beginning with the business model canvas. We are working with our HR team internally to understand the value proposition of working at Independence Blue Cross. And it's a really neat project, and we're really excited about it because we're part of that culture, and I'm thrilled to be working in an organization that understands the importance of talking to your employees and hearing what they want and need and feel. And part of that is that we will be doing 50 interviews with employees, which is a small subset of our employee base. So we could not make recommendations to the HR team about where they need to go next if we didn't talk to people to understand what their current perceptions are about what the value prop is beyond a paycheck and medical benefits, right? Because that's what we're really looking to understand. We want to know, yes, we know you come to work for a paycheck, that's a given, but what else, right? What else is so meaningful to you? I can tell you my experience, I can tell you what's meaningful to me, but that doesn't mean that's meaningful to everybody else. And Sue hit on it, you really have to get a diverse group. So when we look at who we're interviewing, we're looking at tenure, we're looking at diversity in gender, race, background, age, all of it, right? Because we want to get a really good subset. Job title, certainly, level in the organization. So we want to get a wide range and then be able to see if stories and themes emerge based on, well, maybe one set of people who have been here fewer than 3 years think one thing, but people who have been kind of lifers here for 20 plus years think a totally different thing. Well, that's really good to know because that means we have to design different solutions for them potentially, right? So the goal of that project is to help create a roadmap for what our HR team will do in the coming years. But to do that, again, we really have to be focused on what are current perceptions. That's the qualitative piece. We'll also do other research. We'll do other research to understand trends and to understand best practices and to look at what our peers and competitors are doing. So all of that happens as well. But without the qualitative piece, we would be lost. We would be shooting in the dark and making recommendations based on our own bias and what I think is important. And that's not going to work.
True.
Building on that for both you guys, you talk feelings and emotions are critically important. What happened when you had interviews where you didn't talk the emotions or you didn't get that emotional response from people? How did those projects turn out?
You pull it out of them. You shine a spotlight on them and you pull it out of them. I mean, look, that's really our job in interviews, is to be able to do that, right? We ask, I loved your topic guide, Sue. We do the same thing, right? You come up with a list of questions and we keep ours very broad and open-ended. And one of my favorite things to do is say, tell me a story about the last time you went to work. What was that like? Or tell me how that worked, or tell me what you thought of it. So we keep it very open-ended. My students are fantastic at doing terrible interviews and getting the one-word responses. So they come back and they say, okay, we interviewed people about using their textbooks because they wanted to, work on an idea for reusing and reselling textbooks. And we asked them if they use them again, and they said no. I went, awesome. What did we learn? Nothing, right? So when you're not getting those feelings and emotions, and when you're getting the one-word answers, you've really done a disservice to yourself and to the person you've talked to because you haven't gotten any information that you can use and will help form your ideas or, give you anything to work with.
Yeah, it's an important point. And Michelle, sometimes, maybe it's not the person who's closest to the information that's doing the interview. Sometimes it may require a third party who's doing. That's why a lot of our clients ask us to do the research for them, because people might feel more open talking to a third party than they would feel talking directly, and especially if there is a level of ownership or passion to the project.
That's such a good point. We had a lot of conversation, particularly for the HR project I mentioned, around, gosh, are people going to talk to us and be honest because we're in the organization? Yeah. We've really tried to position, I like to say we have a brand within our independence brand for innovation. So we've really tried to position ourselves as this almost inside outside auxiliary team where we're set a little bit apart, and that's intentional so that we can get some accurate feedback. But that actually, that comes up, and that's a real concern.
Yeah,
that's a good.
Actually, both of you guys just touched on something about comfort of interviewing people directly. What about, is there any risk of creating a bias in the research that you're doing? How do you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there is. The key, I think, is in the questions, in the preparation that you make for the interviews. So in defining the topic guide and the questions that you're going to ask, that can be very telling in terms of how the conversation will go. But Michelle described, this back and forth that's part of the interview when we're talking on one-on-one interviews. That gives you the opportunity to sort of redirect if you feel like maybe the question itself has been leading. It's in some of the other formats of research that you have to be careful. So if you design, for example, a survey, an online survey, you don't have the chance to sort of come back. You can take a look at the results and you can see how the results are going. You can say, well, maybe we were a little bit biased in this question. We need to ask it a little bit differently. But there is another way to do some discovery, and I'm sure Michelle has done this too and may even be doing this with her employees as part of her research, but that's to look at a focus group, and that's where you pull like-minded people together, and it's often a way that you can kind of test your presumptions and things like that. And that environment is, I think, one where it really does bring people out in terms of sharing, because they're in a room. Sometimes you're not in the room, sometimes you're in the room and you're conducting it, sometimes you're behind a glass, or but once people get going, then the others in the group feel very compelled to share, and I think a focus group can be a really nice way to do it.
Actually, you just asked the question, I want to get into tactics of actually doing research. You mentioned one-to-one interviews, you mentioned digital things like surveys, you mentioned focus groups. For both of you guys, what's your number one way to collect data and why?
For me, interviews. We do interviews more than anything else. Why? Because in some ways, to echo what Sue said earlier, they're easy, right? It sounds daunting when you haven't done them, but it's a conversation, right? So we're all decent at conversation. There are some key things you have to do to avoid bias, but we're all able to conduct conversations. So I think interviews for us is the most frequent. We don't do surveys as often. I have a love-hate with surveys. I think you can get some really good information, but then other times you're like, oh, but what does this mean? And you can't ask. So we use surveys sometimes, not as often. The thing that I wish we got to do more of is observation. We don't do as much observation. So just because we're not in a position necessarily to be in people's homes, although I have colleagues in other industries who do go into the home and observe people using things and whatnot. So we don't do as much observation as I like, but for us, it's not, hands down, interviews is what we do the most.
I'm going to interrupt for a second. Susan, before you hop in, Michelle, can you quantify observation a little more? You hinted at it, but just in case the audience doesn't know, what really is observational interviews?
Yeah, so We talk about observation as watching people interact with or go through whatever journey you're designing around. So if I talk about it frequently in terms of web design, right? Because if I'm redesigning our customer portal, I want to watch people use the portal, and I want to see if that form that I think is really easy to access, does it take them 20 clicks to get to it? Because that's a problem, right? And they may forget to tell you. I always say that people will say one thing and do another, and that's not because they're pathological liars. It's because only those things that are really frustrating or are really standing out to them are things that they'll mention. But there may be other things that happen, and when you observe, you can see those things, right? So my most basic example is, I'd say I'm a big tea drinker. If you come to my house and watch me, I make a lot of cups of tea. I don't drink them because it gives me heartburn. So apparently I find something very comforting about having a warm cup of tea, but they're sitting all over. So if you were to observe me, I would tell you one thing, but if you observe me, you would see something very different. And that's how we use observation to see, where do people get hung up? What works well for them? What interactions do they forget to mention?
All right, so Susan, I want to return that back to you about asking, again, you mentioned everything. What works for, your type of work? What kind of data collection do you like the best, and why?
Yeah, that was really fascinating, Michelle, to talk about the observations. I think that's really important. Um, did I tell you this before, Mike? A former boss that I had, he used to say, there's a difference between research and me search. Me search is how we feel, but then when you start talking to people, that's not research. But I guess of the three that we talked about, which is in these one-on-one interviews, doing a survey, a digital survey, or focus groups, I would say that we most often do the one-on-one interviews. And the value of those, and Michelle hit on it, is to be able to get into a deeper conversation and go back and forth and really target the things that you're trying to learn from the interview. So you have to do a lot of research a lot of preparation in the beginning to make sure that you're asking the right questions. But that type of research allows you to take it in a direction and to sort of understand get more to the results that you're hoping for in terms of what you expect to learn from the research. There's a fourth thing that we do with our clients that I just wanted to mention as part of the research and discovery process, and that's to take all the research that they have done in the past and make sure that we have access to that. We read through that, and then we can to have the benefit of research that they've conducted in the past, even if it's 1 or 2 year old research that they've done. That is always helpful to us to sort of start from there and have access to that. So that's an important thing to remember as well.
Susan, question: as you're saying research, you're bringing back traumatic memories of having to pull all these tomes of books out of the library, and I'm having a small panic attack of thinking about having to actually write and consolidate all that info. When you guys are talking research and data collection, what's the bare minimum you need? Where do you start? Where's the point where you can start building a hypothesis?
Yeah, it's this is not scary stuff, and it's not expensive. There are certainly companies that only do research, and so that may be a way to go, depending on what your objectives are. But for us, it's more about having the correct sample, not size, but in terms of making sure that you're covering all aspects of the audience that you're hoping to reach. So it's really more about that. It's making sure when you design the research that you have a good sample that gives you information across all areas. So that's really more important than the amount of research, and really it's the best part of the process. And I think that when we're working with our clients, that they're most interested in is when we report it back, because they really want to hear what people think. What do they think about the product that we've designed? What do they think about our company? What do they think about it's it's the highlight of the research process for the clients, I think, is the hearing back the results.
Michelle, what about you? Is there a point for IBX where there's a bare minimum, or is there a, can you actually validate what you're looking at after just one interview?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I think, like Susan said, I don't know that we ever say, okay, guys, once we get 52 articles, we're good to go. But in the recent example I gave for the HR project, we said, well, 40 to 50 employee interviews feels like the right sample size because we want to make sure we get a good range of experience, tenure, background, like I said. And we have probably about 5,000 people in our building, so we thought, okay, that's a good sample size. In terms of the secondary kind of research and looking at best practices and things like that, I think we try to think about, have we turned over all the stones we want to, right? So we know going in, okay, we want to know what the trends are in this space, and we want to know what other people are doing in this space, right? Those are kind of always givens. And then beyond that, we think about, so what are some, we call it related worlds or analogous experiences, right? So what are some people who are really good at this thing we're looking at? So if this thing we're looking at is engagement, who's really good at engaging totally outside of our industry, and what can we find on them? So we did an entire innovation challenge around engagement and loyalty, and we looked at places like Lululemon. Lululemon has like a cult following. They're great at getting people to buy $90 yoga pants and be part of their yoga thing, instead of going to Old Navy and buying, $20 yoga pants. Why is that? What do they do? And there are articles upon articles and case studies about what they do. They have a very deliberate method for doing that. So when we're thinking research, we're thinking about what are all of the things we want to learn and how do we find them out? And do we feel like we have a good sample? Like Susan said, it's a matter of, if we've read one article, it's never enough, right? We move pretty rapidly in our projects. So I would say most of our projects, if we're going to run the full design process from start to finish, we try to do that somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks. So we turn projects around really quickly. We talk a lot about momentum and keeping things moving. So in that 8-week period, we'll spend 3 of those 8 weeks on research, and then move really rapidly through the rest. What is that? Isn't there a quote? Is it a Ben Franklin quote? Or maybe it's an Einstein quote, right? About like spending most of your time understanding the problem and then like a second solving it or something. I should know that quote if I'm going to use it. Sorry. I think that just speaks to the importance of this piece of it, right? Ideas are cheap. We all have ideas all the time. It's a matter of really understanding the problem before we get to the ideas. So we spend a good amount of time on research, but it's hard to say what's enough and what that looks like.
To the general audience listening, please, if you guys have questions, feel free to add them in the chat as we're engaging with both Susan and Michelle here. In the meantime, I have a couple other questions I want to ask, which is I want to go the inverse way of, when is there too much information? Or the second question, can you ever fully validate what you're researching? How do you tell someone that they want 100% proof of what they're looking at?
I don't know. I think for us, we've been fortunate in that most of the time our business areas are trusting what we tell them. We're just we have trustworthy faces, I guess. But I think most of the time, there's an understanding that, oh, wow, you've talked to customers. I believe what you're telling me. I think before our function came along, just thinking about the business that I'm in and kind of just the way of working in business, it wasn't as typical or common to go out and talk to customers for us when we first started this function, right? So I think there was a lot of excitement and novelty around, oh, you're talking to customers? We believe what you say. That's so neat, right? That's so great. So I don't know that we've had a situation where we've had a lot of disbelief from our customer, who often is an internal customer, that is what you're saying true. But in terms of when is there too much information, all the time. We could talk to hundreds of people, we could research for the rest of our days. I think often that relates to having the right level of challenge statement that we're going in with. So what I mean by that is, as we talked about in the beginning of this, we're often reacting to a problem. We're trying to fix something. And one thing that we focus intently on is making sure that when we start out, we have something that's not boiling the ocean and something that's not so narrow. So if we go in and say, oh, wow, we've got to research for the rest of our lives, that problem statement is probably too broad, and we probably have to narrow down and focus a little bit more for us to work on that. Does that make sense?
No, it totally does. And something as you're walking through all of this, we've talked a lot about some of the generals. So let's start moving into maybe science and technology. It's a different approach than just the traditional surveying potential homeowners or the wearers of Lululemon. So let's walk through what have you guys learned that those nuances of engaging with this particular industry vertical?
I can speak to the technology piece a little bit. I think a good learning for me, probably fairly early on in my role, maybe a year or two in, we were working with some other Blue partners. We have Blue Cross Blue Shields across the country, and we were working with them on a concept we thought would make sense, which was, could we make the scheduling process easier when you're scheduling with your doctor, right? And we did a lot of customer discovery. We actually set up a session wherein people could come in and give us really rapid insight. So we used our innovation space at the time, and we set up almost stations where you could stop and give different feedback around different pieces. What apps do you engage with? Oh, because by the way, we were going in with the assumption that we would want to do an app. We kind of started with an idea in mind. So we're starting in the middle of the design process and we're going back. So we had stations set up to get feedback from folks, and we wanted to know, what is it like to schedule with your doctor? How does it go now? What is that process? What's good about it? What's bad about it? What apps do you engage with? Why? So as we think about this, and one of the things that we did is we asked them, would you want an app to schedule doctor's appointments? And unanimously, people said no. And although at the same time, they told us how hard it was to schedule appointments, most of them. The great majority said things like, well, I call and I leave a message and then they call me back, but I'm at work and I'm in a meeting and then I call back again. So we heard it's really hard. Oh, but no, I don't want an app to make it easier. And we were like, what in the world? There's a huge disconnect here. I think with technology-led innovation, people don't know what they want very often, right? And my example I'll give is, I remember when the iPhone came out that could read your face to unlock your phone, and my kids all thought it was really cool and wanted it. And I said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You don't need your iPhone to look at your face. It's silly. And lo and behold, I now have the iPhone that looks at your face, and it really is easier, right? Of course I got it. So, and it's a lot easier. I could not have told you half of the things that I wanted this phone to do, but the fact that Apple knows to make them is great, and I'm thrilled about it. So I think when it comes to technology, what I'm trying to say is, this is a different kind of customer discovery. It's not saying, do you want this feature? Do you want this function? Because people don't know. If you're not a technologist, if you don't understand how it's going to work or how it's going to improve the process flow of what you're using, they won't know. I think in those cases, it's much more important to build a prototype, start at the prototype phase, and right, that's more of your lean startup kind of build, measure, learn, build it, let people see it or try it if you can, and then have them react to that, because they just don't know what they're looking for all the time. Does that make sense?
So far, Susan, what do you think?
Yeah, so the example that we started with in terms of the case study about the work that we are doing with the CEO Council for Growth and Select Greater Philadelphia Council on the Cell and Gene Therapy and Connected Health Initiative is certainly in this science and technology and healthcare field. So what we learned is, we're not the experts in this field. We're talking to the experts in this field. So again, I think it comes down to being able to identify the right people to talk to, make sure that the sample size that you have is really representative of the topic or the industry that you are focusing on, and then do a lot of listening, because especially when you're talking to researchers, their expertise, their knowledge, their experience was just overwhelming in terms of listening to the details and things like that, and in terms of the sharing the science. So it's writing really quickly and trying to absorb as much, making sure that we had done our research before we talked to each individual, so that we weren't coming at it without, we only had 30 minutes, so we had to be really well prepared for each of these conversations and make sure that we're asking them.
Susan, that brings up if I may interrupt you for a second, you talked about only having 30 minutes to sit down and understand a technology with a scientist.
Yeah.
Is that, how important is it for scientists to be able to, talk about what they're doing in, call it plain language, or, be able to easily communicate what they're doing, especially for you or for the general public?
Yeah, well, our job is to take what they're telling us and then make that in the language that makes sense for the audience, whatever audience that is. So in terms of the research, we had 30 minutes because we knew that was a segment of time that we could get their attention and they're very, very busy and their time is very limited. So we wanted to make sure that we were respectful of that time. Of course, we have gone back. We did go back to explore other things when it became important information in our storytelling to go back. So there's always the opportunity to do that, but it's not always up to the scientist to have to make it in language that is understandable to multiple audiences. There are people that are there to do that, and that's part of the process of creating the messaging. Depending on if we're talking to a science reporter, we don't have to be that general. The specifics are very good, but if we're talking to a somebody who it's not their field, but we want to communicate them, we have to do it in a different way. So it depends. It depends on the audience.
If we have a question for the audience, but before I want to hand over to that, assuming if someone didn't have some of the resources like a phenomenal writer like your firm, are there 2 or 3 tips you can give someone to be able to make it easier to communicate what they're working on?
Yeah, so I would say try a couple things that are practice. One is write it down, and then read it to somebody who may not be in the field and see what they understood from what you read to them. The other idea is we all have access, and we've learned this lately, to technology and to be able to use video and things like that with our phones, right, Michelle? So another thing is to sort of record yourself, describing it, and then watch it and see how you come across in terms of the way you're presenting it, and then also share that with another sample of people, another research piece, and ask them what they learned from what you said, and use that research to inform whether you were able to convey your message clearly. Those are just 2. You asked for 3, right?
That's pretty cool. So if you have 1 or 2 you can add on that, and then I'm going to ask, I have a question that came in from the audience.
Yeah, we actually ask people to draw it and sketch it out too. And people, the look of fear on their face, because people are like, I'm not an artist. And we're like, that's okay. You haven't seen us draw. So I think that's one of the other big ones we use, storyboarding. So if I tell somebody, sketch that out for me comic book style, pane by pane, so I understand exactly how it works. And then I love the first one you said, it's, explain it to me so that anybody can understand it. I'll say, guys, I know nothing about this. You're the expert in this. Explain it to me like I'm your child and you're explaining to me. And really just asking them to dumb it down even more, and not dumb it down in a bad way, right? Dumb it down, I think, has a negative connotation, but really making it layman's terms, 4th grade reading level kind of stuff.
No, and that's everyone thinks back to the urban legend of Warren Buffett. How would he invest? It used to be he had to be able to explain any investment to his at the time 80-year-old sister, and if he couldn't explain it to her so she understood, he wouldn't invest. Also heard the same thing. When you're talking to a VC, explain it in very, very simple second grader language, because sometimes we're dumb. This question came in from the audience, and this is a really good one. Can you guys talk to the difference between stakeholder discovery versus customer discovery?
Sure. So I saw that question come in. I think I'm going to assume that what you mean by stakeholder is who are all of the other people surrounding this process, right? And I think that happens a lot in our work because we're very often working with internal customers, right? And we are a large company. So when we have an internal customer we're working with, we have to think about who are all of the other departments impacted by this. So when we are doing design sessions or design work, we are pulling all of those different stakeholders into a room. So I would say that is equally important depending on what you're working on, right? So if you are making a product that you want to see on the shelves of Target, you really better make sure you have good customer discovery. But my job, I'm kind of an intrapreneur, right? Like working in an organization, and it is equally important and sometimes more important depending on the project that we're talking to the other stakeholders in the building and getting buy-in and making sure that a process we're building over here is going to work over here. We'll do in the beginning when we're doing our research planning, we'll do what we call a people map. So the old term is stakeholder map, right? But we will literally sketch out, we do a lot of sketching, we will literally sketch out who are maybe the customers or users at the center, but then who are all of the people coming off of that who are related so that we're hitting all stakeholders, and then doing planning around, so what is our research plan for all of these stakeholders? What are the questions we're asking these guys? Who's getting in the room with us when we design? So making sure we're addressing everybody, because otherwise it just won't work.
Yeah, and I would just add that depending on the project, that the stakeholder is the customer. So, if you're seeking funding, or maybe that's how you define your customer.
Yeah, that's a great point. It depends, what your situation is. But yes, I think equally important that you're talking to other folks, covering everybody kind of who's in the mix, right?
I wanted to go back again to the sort of process of reporting on the results from research. Maybe Michelle and I could tell a little bit about that, because I really do think that is an exciting part of the research process, and I really like when we give the feedback. Mike, you had kind of touched on this as well in saying, how much research should you do? Do you research until you got the answer you want? Like, how do you know? And it's really interesting to then present the findings and see if those findings were not what the client was expecting or the researcher was expecting. That's pretty interesting. We haven't, in our experience, really come across people saying, well, that's different than we thought, but that can't be right. We definitely have to look at the finding and sort of think about that. But it's more that people are open to understanding and hearing these new things. And that's a really exciting part of the process. I can think about an example of our firm worked on some research for a university. They had some assumptions about how they were what their assets were in terms of the way they were promoting themselves, but they wanted to do some research, and they looked at two groups. One was to interview alumni, and the other was to talk to deans of other schools and kind of see and sort of test the messaging. And of course, the alumni had described the major attributes of the university in one way, but then the outside audience described it in a different way, and that was then something that they could use in terms of how they're promoting themselves. And so it's always very interesting research, and to me, there can't be enough. I think the important thing is to continue to do it. If situations change, environments change, I think it's important to then go back. But what's nice about research is then you can kind of pull on it throughout the process. We use it to develop messaging, and we use it to develop communications plans, and we constantly go back to the research in terms of validating why we're doing something and helping to create the direction.
So, Susan, you actually also led into a question I want to talk about. You talked about, the environmental issues of the environment changing in terms of probably the hypothesis of the business. Let's talk a little bit about this was supposed to be a live event in person. With the changes in because of the pandemic, how do people do customer discovery today? Is it easier? Is it harder? Are there tricks and some tips that both you guys can suggest to generate as good a result so that we're not losing months of time?
Mm,
Good question.
correct.
Yeah, I am a very much in-person person. So this is challenging doing this. And we've been conducting interviews, actually interviews for a position. And one thing I'd say is certainly you can conduct interviews from afar, that it's, because it's a conversation. What I really miss from being in person, not in a weird new agey way, but kind of reading that person's energy and reading what they're, right? I mean, there's something very real about being next to somebody and feeling their reactions as they're answering questions. So you miss out on that. I think certainly I lean toward something like this where I can see the person at the very least. I think being on the phone is my last choice because you can't see them at all and you don't know what their facial expressions look like or what their reactions are. We are picking and choosing when it makes sense to do these kinds of interviews. For the HR project I mentioned, we are deliberately holding off. We know people aren't feeling themselves right now, so that would skew our data and our results because we're asking about the value prop of work and you're not at work and you're in a weird headspace and that doesn't make sense. For other projects though, it's very feasible to do interviews this way. So I don't think you have to stop everything you're doing. We're focusing a lot on the secondary research, going online, best practices, trends. We are also focusing a lot when we can use surveys. We're looking at data from a previous survey that we had collected, so reading through that and seeing what makes sense there. But I think you still can do interviews this way.
Yeah, I think Michelle answered that beautifully. You really have to be aware of the environment so that when you're and how people are feeling and what they're experiencing when you reach out to them. You can see that in a lot of the change in the advertising that's happening right now. If you're watching any of that or the messaging that people are putting on social media, and when something is not paying attention to the environment, it sticks out. You can really, I'm sure you can think of many examples of that even in the last couple of weeks as we are in the middle of the pandemic. But I think that people are very innovative and just in terms of finding ways to do things like this session and how many of us were able to get up to speed quickly on using technology to help us get where we need to be. So I don't think that it's a time where you have to hold off on important research if it's something that's very timely for you and you need the research in order to continue your work and your developments. It's as Michelle said, just being sensitive to the environment and the audience's understanding that the results may have an impact. We just listened to a reporting out of a piece of research last week, and the research was conducted prior to all of this. So you have to, in reporting out that research, the research organization was clear to point out that this all took place ahead of it, and we'll have to look at it and have conversations with our stakeholders as to how that is now different, what has been impacted. So those are important things to think about. But again, Michelle and I both voted for the interviews, and certainly those can be done by phone, and they can be done visually by phone as well. So.
And actually, you just brought up about moving into stakeholders, getting feedback from stakeholders. We had another question come in around roundtable discussions, or also assume focus groups. So, as you guys talk through the process of customer discovery, when is it appropriate to do roundtable discussion, focus groups?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we like to use focus groups when we're testing things, to sort of, if we've come up with some messaging and we want to see if we're correct in that messaging, and or it's very typical in advertising to test a campaign. We've done that with focus groups as well. So I think that that's an excellent time to use it, to use a focus group like that, and to just again, it requires a good leader, a moderator, Mike, to do that, to keep the conversation going and make sure that you're getting out of that what you need to get. You have to be careful that one person doesn't sort of monopolize the conversation, and you'd have to be able to watch for people who are looking like they have something to say but aren't sharing it, to encourage them to share, and make sure that you hear from everybody that's a participant. But I really do like the idea of these roundtable discussions or focus groups in terms of testing something or seeing if we're on the right track.
Yeah, we're the same. I'd say we most often use that format probably after we've done our ideas. So once we've gone through our idea phase, we will put all of the ideas up on the wall, or we'll put a set of prioritized ideas up on the wall, and we'll get folks in the room to do some voting, sometimes with dot stickers, voting on the ones that they like best or that resonate the most with them, whether it's a business idea or a piece of a process or a marketing campaign or language. We'll sometimes have them do sticky notes individually about what they like and what they don't like, or what sits well and what doesn't, to your point of kind of getting everyone's feedback and giving them an opportunity. And it's heavy facilitation. It's making sure that you have a really strong facilitator who can lead that group and get to the right outcome, whatever that right outcome is for you.
Yeah.
Well, you guys.
Sorry, Mike. I was just going to say roundtable discussions, focus groups. That's very often where you'll get a product name, some language for advertising. Those are really fun.
Excellent, excellent. I have one last question I want to ask both you guys, which is, for those that are on the call that are just starting this journey, or picture yourself in their shoes, what is one or two pieces of advice you could give to them to avoid mistakes that you've made, or those critical learnings that were very painful?
You want to go? You want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one thing is, I think it happens often for people who are not familiar with the design process. I think it's seen as this mystical, hard thing to do. And now, of course, I'm very entrenched in it, but I feel the opposite. I feel like most of design thinking is like the most obvious stuff that you should do. So I think don't be intimidated by any of it. You will find that everybody who talks about this stuff has different language for it. I think that's the biggest learning curve, right? All of the processes that have been mentioned, Lean Startup, Lean Six Sigma, design thinking, there's an actual process called creative problem solving. I think they're all the same. They all have different language and different terminology, and that's probably the biggest stumbling block, because you're like, wait, customer discovery, is that the same as insight gathering? Is that the same as design research? Is that the same as, yes, the answer is yes, probably, right? So I think just taking your time to simplify the processes, because it is all very simple, and not getting overwhelmed, and just looking for the really practical tools that you can apply all the time.
Yes, if you're on this call and you're curious, you like to learn, you like to discover things. You're research oriented already. It's not hard. It's not scary. It's not expensive. It's just being curious. Think about what you want to know and turn those into questions. Find out who you want to know it from, and make those people part of your interview list or your focus group or your survey. It's a natural process. It's what we do every day. So just figure out the things that you need to know in terms of what your objectives are, what you need to learn, to what you need to discover, and ask the questions that you're thinking about. That's really the process. It is not difficult. I'm excited that we were able to talk about it for an hour, but it's not.
Well, and we probably could keep going. And by the way, you know, Michelle, you hit on the point, which I think, Susan, I think they ran a whole bunch of focus groups with all the different formats to come up with all the different names for customer discovery along the way. And Susan, I also want to trademark research versus me search. I can't tell you the number of times I thought I was doing research and I was just validating what I thought as me search. So
Yes,
trademark that so
I
you and Nick know how to say it.
I would tell my former boss, Sam Rogers. He owns that one.
With that, I want to hand this back to our host, Michelle, give some parting thoughts. I both want to thank you guys again for your time and making an hour or more of talking about customer discovery. We probably could keep going, except Michelle's going, no, cut it, we're done, we're bored.
Definitely no one bored at this end of the panel. Thank you all of you, so much for your time today. This is a really fantastic discussion. You can tell by the level of audience engagement that folks were very much interested in what you had to say. So thank you, Sue, Michelle, and Mike, very much for your time. And thank you also once again to our sponsors. We appreciate MVM Associates, Cesare Revis, and University Place Associates. We couldn't do this without folks like them. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this was a little bit of an experiment for us here at BioStrategy Partners to do our first ever remote Practical Knowledge Series panel, but I think it went off very well. It's certainly great content that will be recorded and shared with the folks here, both joining us today live. You'll get a link as well as our regular mailing list. So we can't thank you enough for your engagement today, all of you, audience and panelists alike.